Let's get started. This is the second in our monthly series of Contemporary China Talks, and we have a lot more in the hopper. We won't do next month, but we'll be back in January and then do months thereafter. So if you've been to a bunch of these and you've seen the body language between me and Damien and the speakers, you can be forgiven for thinking that we just invite our friends to give these talks. And it's not actually true, but in this case, I will confess it actually is true. Gady's an old pal and our favorite, I think you're just about our favorite China correspondent who's no longer a China correspondent. Gady has recently left China after many, many years at a variety of different publications. He's become a New York, you're a hipster in New York now, living in a cool neighborhood and covering media for the Economist magazine. But for a long time, Gady was the Beijing bureau chief of the Economist. And before that was the Forbes magazine bureau chief in Beijing for the Economist. For Forbes magazine bureau chief. And before that, wrote for the Baltimore Sun, a regional paper, one of those regional papers that nobody reads anymore, but back in the glory days of journalism, used to have overseas bureaus, whether it was the Chicago Tribune or the Baltimore Sun or the Minneapolis, the Star Ledger? Star Tribune, thank you. I'm a Minnesotan there. So Gady has been around China for a long time and around media for a long time. And even though he's back, he is, I think, from my perspective, one of the most insightful people on China and how it's changed, partly because he has the benefit of perspective, but partly because he has sometimes a counter-conventional take on things. So speaking of that, the only thing I really want to say by way of introduction is to say something about, well, we didn't project it, but the topic that Gady's going to talk about is what happens essentially if the Chinese political system proves to be more enduring than conventional wisdom nowadays seems to think that it is. It's not a particularly new insight to say that the Chinese system is brittle. It's been brittle for a long time. Because if you think about it, this is a country, let's think about it. It's a communist party that rose to power in a revolution that had a very big peasant and rural component. Yet here you have, 100,000 plus social protests all over the country every year, many of them in rural areas. You have a country with one official labor union federation, the All China Federation of Labor Unions. Workers don't unionize, and yet you still have strikes around this country. You have a government that has many of the powers of a police state, frankly, and yet you still have crime in this country. So the system is brittle, but people have always assumed that the system was resilient, even though it was brittle. But lately, we've seen kind of creep into the debate about China a sense that maybe the system can't endure. And so you've had a kind of plethora of collapsists who argue that the system is, maybe it's not going to collapse by next Tuesday, but, it's coming to a point of reckoning where the state or the system simply won't be able to adjust to the number of challenges that have been wrought or produced by social, economic, and potentially political change in the country. But to those who've been around China for a long time, even though, as I said, the system is brittle, the system has a lot about it that actually has proved to be rather resilient in the past, which begs a lot of interesting questions. What are the sources of resilience? How adaptive is the Chinese Communist Party? How adaptable is the Chinese political system? And so at a time when these arguments have crept into the debate, but also when the scope, scale, pace, and tenor of, I think, social and economic change are so great in China, beneath the headlines, if you go a lot, you see so much is changing. People's attitudes, the way people relate to each other, to institutions, to the state, that these questions have become much more interesting today. And so Gady, with his, you're not really, are you counter-conventional? You're counter-conventional in the sense that so many of these people seem to be dominating the debate these days. We thought it would be interesting to have Gady come and, do kind of an exit talk. How do you see China as you have now left after all these years, but also talk a little bit about this theme of resilience that I've heard you talk about privately, and where you see the system going and how you see it adapting to change or not. So we got a good crowd for you, and what we always do is just have you come up. We're very casual, so you do your thing, and then you'll do your own Q&A, and welcome to the University of Chicago. Gady Epstein.
Thank you. Yeah. Am I mic'd already?
Oh, yeah, you can.
Thanks to the University of Chicago for hosting me here, for Paulson Institute for bringing me here. Thank you, Evan, Damien, Dinda, many others. And I see some familiar faces in the audience I haven't seen in like 20 years as well. So it's great to see people here. I am I think to put it in the parlance Evan just used about collapse, I'm probably, you could call me a recovering collapsist. And I wanted to talk today about kind of how I have kind of transformed my views on China over the years from being on the ground there for 11 and a half out of the last 13 years. We spend a lot of time as journalists evaluating problems, and I think at our best exposing systemic issues, systemic flaws. We're well trained, I mean, this is anywhere, right, in the US or in China. We are well trained to take a politician's promises and expose how hollow they are. Now in China, this is an extremely rewarding proposition. The party has given us a lot of material to work with from when I first arrived in 2002, from taking people's homes without compensation, to letting factories pollute in exchange for a piece of the action or bribes, to allowing coal mine owners to run dangerous, deadly coal mines for the same reasons. All these things were things I covered at the Baltimore Sun. And then going to Forbes, covering more of the business side of this issue, the nexus of the state and private business and corruption. Then you're running into other systemic issues. Let's say at those same coal mines, accidents not being reported because journalists are taking bribes to cover up those incidents. If they're small enough that people haven't noticed them, then you will never hear about them. And then there's a price list based on what media organization you are, what size media organization you are in terms of how much money you can get for it. So I never lacked for such stories in my time at the Baltimore Sun and Forbes. When I came to The Economist in 2011, I was determined to spend a lot more time explaining more about how the system worked. And that's what I want to focus on today, how the system works. There are two dominant dueling narratives when it comes to China. People gravitate to them. There's the bull or the bear, the dragon slayer or the panda hugger. And becoming fluent on China demands a regular letting go of these perspectives, these biases. There are some stories that are told in almost precise, and can be told and have been told in precisely the opposite way from each other, with equal and opposite evidence. The role of NGOs in society, land reform, the internet, even the economy. How you saw these stories said as much about your perspectives as it did about China. Was China an exciting place that was transforming socially and economically and maybe in some ways politically? Or was it a place where independence, creativity, innovation, and freedoms were being stifled by a repressive political culture? Are an increasing number of Chinese frustrated with injustice, or is an increasing number of Chinese happy? You pick your data set and you go with it. How do you reckon with the fact that the number of suicides in China has plummeted in the last 25 years, in the last 20 years, in all demographics, urban and rural? You used to hear the stories about young rural women committing suicides in China at the highest rates in the world. That is no longer true, and it hasn't been true actually for 15 years. How do you reckon with the fact that so China executes right now more than 2,000 people a year, far more than the rest of the world combined, but they actually have reduced executions by 80% since 2002. So is it a cruel justice system that is inherently unfair, or is it actually trying hard to improve some conditions within that system? Some measure of both. Coal mines that I mentioned before. They were famous for killing thousands of people a year, every year. In 2002, the official figure was 7,000, and the real figure was probably over 10,000. Unless you read The Economist, you probably didn't notice that it hasn't. That they've last year the number was less than 1,000 people that died in coal mine accidents. Still a lot, but they also produced 2.5 times more coal now than they did then. The number of people killed per ton of coal produced has fallen by like a factor of 20. And none of these things were by accident. The number of executions dropping, the number of coal mine deaths dropping, there was something at work trying to make this happen. Now, at the same time, in coal mines, thousands of workers every year are still getting black lung disease, a much more subtle problem that is much harder to address, and that's actually not that hard to prevent, but harder systemically to address. And so this kind of gives you a little bit of a picture. I'm starting to give you a little bit of a picture of the complexities of the system and how they try to attack problems. China requires us to constantly reorient or recalibrate our perspectives because the story just doesn't fit one mold. Is the party state endemically incapable of addressing serious problems due to corruption and ineffective bureaucracy? Or is it picking the problems it can take on and gradually and methodically attacking them? So Xi Jinping came along and tested how we think about this. He seems to sum a very one-note story. Sinologist Jeremy Barmay calls him the chairman of everything. He draws comparisons to Deng or Mao or both. But he actually gives us an opportunity to test an essential question of whether there is a China model that he is working within. And if so, can it endure? We know there's been a lot of other talk out there about a China model, or there's been a narrative that they figured out something. There was the Beijing consensus that was replacing the Washington consensus. We had Daniel Bell recently write a book called The China Model. His was the take that it was a meritocratic system, or it's becoming one. About that, scholar Andrew Nathan said it sounds like a nice idea, but it doesn't exist in practice. I agree with that much. But why has this system survived until now, as Evan was just saying? What has made China so resilient? Why has communism not collapsed? Now, as it turns out, there's a helpful book on this question. It's called Why Communism Did Not Collapse. Edited by Martin Dimitrov, with contributions from a lot of scholars who have poked around at why communism of various forms, but in particular China, has been so resilient. Now, before I get to that, I wanted to share that this has been a long journey for me of discovery, both personally and intellectually. It's not a journey that ends with me believing that Chinese people are not ready for democracy, or that Chinese culture is somehow so different that we shouldn't judge its system through the prism of so-called Western liberal values. But there was an intellectual fallacy that I think I fell into, that plagued others as well, which was to view China as the same sort of creature as other collapsed communist states, when it was quite clear that they were working much harder to adapt and evolve. And I'll start with where I was at the beginning of that journey. I arrived in China sort of a child of Fukuyama and the end of history. And I mean that literally. Dr. Francis Fukuyama, a Hyde Park native, I learned. His famous essay came out in the spring of 1989 when I was a 16-year-old junior in high school. I had been to the Soviet Union the previous summer. That was under Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika. The following summer, right after the essay appeared, the Berlin Wall falls and the beginning of the Soviet collapse unfolds. And this was all very shocking to me, who just 2 years earlier had been in Moscow, on the streets of Moscow. Now, of course, as a 15-year-old talking to young Komsomol, members of the young communist youth in Moscow and trading blue jeans on the black market, I wasn't exactly a savvy political analyst and wouldn't have predicted much of anything. But still, I had studied Soviet communism pretty much all my childhood that you would educate anybody from like middle school on. I was learning about Brezhnev and Andropov. We weren't really studying the Chinese model. What we picked up was the Brezhnev era 5-year plan and command economy. And I did my first journalistic enterprise of sorts for social studies class when I was 12. It was the Soviet economy, a newscast. I was the Soviet Dan Rather. And I did this sort of a report on the command economy and how factories couldn't respond flexibly to orders for which size of screw you wanted. It's very riveting television. We were canceled after one episode, but that gives you a sense of the background and experience I had. And I was, and this had a profound effect on my sense of the robustness of democracy. And the inavailability of democracy to overtake communist regimes. I was primed for Fukuyama. Now fast forward to 2002. I'm in China and Hu Jintao is about to take over for Jiang Zemin at the 16th Party Congress. Some China watchers are asking, could he be the next Gorbachev? We don't know much about him. He's a man of mystery, a gray man who has said very little as he's risen, and he's left little trace on his way to the top. Could that be hiding the agenda of a daring and bold reformer? Some asked. Well, it turns out that he was in fact more a gray man, a party man through and through. But we projected onto him our assumptions. This was the world's biggest communist party, making its first leadership change since the collapse of the Soviet Union. There had been mass layoffs at SOEs at that time, gigantic demonstrations in the oppressed Northeast. There were tens of thousands of rural protests a year. There was talk about developing rule of law. Maybe all of this sounds a little familiar. China had entered the WTO and would be far more integrated with the democracies of the West. The internet had arrived and was going to give people information. It was going to make the whole system much harder to control. The old strategies of repression were antiquated and would become much harder to execute in this new era. Change must be coming, right? A few months earlier, in preparing to go to Beijing, one of the books I read was The Coming Collapse of China by Gordon Chang. Now, this was not like an expert tome. It was not scholarship by any means. But to the end of history disciples, to the children of the Cold War, it went straight to the pleasure centers of the brain. I think it was easy and remains easy to look at events in China and think, this will be the challenge that topples them. This could be what tips things over the edge. SARS in 2003, the rise of rights defense lawyers, Wei-Chuan lawyers, using the system's laws to force changes from within, a breed of dissident we had seen work so effectively to chip away at other Asian authoritarian regimes. A few years on, the Tibet riots, the Sichuan earthquake, the Urumqi riots of 2009, the high-speed train crash of 2011, after which mockery and discontent with the government spread so wildly on Weibo. The Bo Xilai and Zhou Yongkang scandal that threatened to rock the leadership transition in 2012. This summer, we had this whole stock market mess that just made the leadership look so incompetent, and an unbelievably massive explosion that left part of one of China's biggest cities looking like a moonscape. Meanwhile, outside of China throughout this time, we've had color revolutions in former Soviet republics and the Arab Spring in the Middle East. It would all be enough to make an authoritarian regime paranoid and insecure. Well, I do think China's leaders are insecure and maybe a little paranoid. I think that's one of their secrets to longevity. Complacent autocrats tend not to last. Chinese communism had its near-death experience in 1989, and after Tiananmen and the fall of the Soviet Union, China's been obsessed with not being next on the list of regimes to fall. So they've studied the past, and especially the Soviet failure, a lot, many, many studies. And this has helped them tweak their system. Deng Xiaoping's preferred formula, economic liberalism and political illiberalism, his kind of chimera of these two, melding these two, eventually became unassailable dogma. Economic growth and nationalism became pillars of legitimacy. These were pillars the Soviet Union was unable to provide. Before Xi Jinping took the helm of the party in 2012, he commissioned yet another study of why the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, at this point, it's hard to see that any new lessons could be drawn. But at this point, Gorbachev had been the ghost haunting China's banquet for more than 2 decades. But Xi Jinping already knew the lessons of Gorbachev. And I won't go through them here, because partly they relate to the lessons that he wanted to draw from this study. He was looking to expurgate another ghost, Leonid Brezhnev's, the guy I was studying in middle school. The party's historians concluded that it was Brezhnev who recoiled from market reforms, condemning the economy to a long, cruel winter. It was Brezhnev who let the rot of corruption and nepotism spread unchecked to the resentment of the masses. It was under Brezhnev that the party began to lose control of the gun, as the Red Army got stuck in the quicksand of Afghanistan, sowing discord and disillusion in the ranks. In their report for Xi, the Party History Research Office found that the edifices of Soviet authority may have finally crumbled under Gorbachev and his naively tolerant policies, but they were hollowed out during Brezhnev's lengthy era of stagnation, neglect, and ideological lassitude. So you see what Xi Jinping is doing. Ideological indoctrination on a scale not seen in generations, infused with a more robust and potentially militant nationalism, his China dream and his talk of sovereignty in the near seas and elsewhere, more strident than any vision the CCP had previously offered, anti-corruption on a historic scale, and pushing his idea of a reform agenda while establishing even more tight control of the internet to silence individual independent voices that would present an alternative narrative on any of these challenges. Beijing will control the ideology. Beijing will define who is corrupt. Beijing will decide what reforms are necessary. Xi is, in essence, doing everything he can to extend the warranty of the China model that was forged under Deng. Economic growth is the prettier half of Deng's chimera. There is real legitimacy contained in rising incomes and in high-speed trains when they don't crash, which they haven't since 2011. But it is not a sufficient recipe for an enduring authoritarian model. As people get richer, they get more demanding. And then when an economy slows, an authoritarian regime is more likely to collapse. About twice as likely according to one analysis, but I wouldn't say that's like a huge data set. That is why now, as China's economy slows, Xi is bringing the uglier half of the chimera into shape, into sharp relief. He has made it more plainly obvious that the idea is not, as some have hoped of China over the years, to evolve into a Western-style system that protects the individual as much as it does the regime. Empowering individuals, tolerating any independent scrutiny of government power would, in Xi's view, undermine the party's ability to rule effectively. No, the idea is to become better and smarter at being authoritarian. But to do that, he will need somehow to bolster a third pillar of legitimacy that has also been essential to China's survival: governance. And here, Dr. Fukuyama re-enters the picture. Fukuyama, seeing that history didn't quite end yet, has written a fair bit in recent years about governments. Done well, it can extend the life of authoritarian states. And this is something that China has actually known for quite a long time. David Shambaugh, in his fine book, Atrophy and Adaptation, explored all these studies the party had done about the Soviet collapse, this obsession that it had. And one of the most influential findings was that they needed to improve drastically the management of cadres and the bureaucracy, to make them accountable to performance goals and the like, and to make them somewhat more competent. The way they managed to do this is by giving millions of cadres throughout the bureaucracy responsibility targets. These had started to come into existence before 1989, but the system really rounded into shape since then. This is the most elaborate corporate human resources exercise in the world. Officials are scored each year, individually and in teams, and on how well they meet a series of targets, like performance benchmarks in a large company. As in a company, these targets are conveyed from the top on down through each successive lower layer of management. Some of these targets are soft ones. Failing to meet will not necessarily do much damage to an official's career. Others are hard ones or veto targets. Failure to meet them means lost promotions, pay rises, etc. And conversely, meeting them brings significant rewards. Maintaining social stability is a perennial veto target. And for many years, enforcing the one-child policy was as well. And I guess now the two-child policy. Economic growth has long been one of the more important targets. Achieving it would bring significant financial rewards, or could in some areas. Softer targets, by contrast, have included such lofty ideals as protecting the environment and following the law. The party's most important mandates, in other words, are quite literally above those things, are above the law. Assessing this from a value-neutral perspective, this system gives bureaucrats the flexibility to decide how best to meet priorities set by the party leadership. If they can deliver economic growth, social stability, and population control while following the law, bully for them. If breaking the law or ignoring environmental regulations or unfairly jailing a few citizens will help deliver economic growth or social stability, so be it. In fact, officials had a systemic imperative to break or ignore laws. When local officials forced sterilizations of women or late-term abortions to enforce the population targets, that was not a perversion of the system. That was a direct manifestation of it. When local officials would allow chemical factories to pollute rivers in the name of economic growth, they were rewarded for it. Of course, this also enabled wholesale corruption. If officials say that cutting corners helped them reach an economic target, when actually they were just taking backhanders, how would anyone know, right? So some of this has shifted over time, and now they're adjusting targets on the environment, making them more important. And hopefully, as targets like cleaner air, cleaner water become more important parts of cadre evaluations, and cadres see their colleagues get rewarded for meeting those targets, you might see change in those areas over a course of 5 years or 10 years. But it's a slow process. It is a ruthless framework for governing, but also an oddly pragmatic and non-ideological one. The regime's interests, after all, include fixing problems for which the regime itself would be blamed, where blame cannot be effectively diverted. And for all of the messes the system creates, it can set about fixing some of them, particularly ones that become national embarrassments. The reduction in coal mine deaths I mentioned, that's one example. They literally set targets on how many people you could allow to die in your area of responsibility, and you had basically death quotas. If you exceeded those, then you were punished accordingly. If you met them, then you were rewarded. Effective but crude. It's a blunt instrument that struggles, though, with subtler problems. So that's, take black lung disease that I mentioned earlier. That takes longer to manifest. It's harder to attribute where it happened, harder to attribute blame, and it's also not as easy to track as large mine explosions. So that continues to be a scourge. And similarly with pollution, PM 2.5, air pollution is pretty easy to monitor. But other forms of pollution, toxic soil, and others are a little bit harder to deal with, especially when you have cadres highly motivated to fudge statistics. We were talking about the wire earlier. I mean, they juked the stats in Baltimore. They also juked the stats in China. Any bureaucracy will do what it has to when there are performance targets involved. But this system of targets still is a way to make a government do at least some of its job right. And I think we have to measure it accordingly. This rule of mandates, as Mei-Ling Burney of London School of Economics calls it, is a way to direct the state's limited capacity toward important priorities. So after these three adaptations, you can call them economic liberalism, nationalism, governance, I would say the fourth adaptation has been to the internet and social media. Many assumed that the internet would pose an existential threat to the party's monopoly on power by giving people access to information and each other in ways the authorities would not be able to control. Yet in defiance of these expectations, the party has actually used the internet to become better at being authoritarian. It has done so by making China's internet into a giant, well-appointed cage, building a great firewall to selectively block foreign websites it doesn't like, nurturing a thriving domestic internet, which provides plenty of distractions for the populace in the greatest Aldous Huxley fashion. And they have an excellent monitoring system. I mean, a well-developed monitoring system for seeing what their people are talking about and listening to what their complaints are. They can censor much of it, but even if it's censored, it doesn't mean it isn't read. And meanwhile, they can aggressively detect when maybe some sort of movement might be forming online, and stop any sort of attempt to organize in what they would call in the embryonic stage. So the internet it's a two-way street as well. They use it to transmit their propaganda through social media and through various platforms, and that is an effective way to communicate the party's values both directly and indirectly. There's this nationalist anti-Western narrative the party's embedded quite successfully into the culture, also translates online. So this transmission effect works, I submit, even when it is being critiqued. This is a kind of an important part of this because, of course, it is critiqued. Just as censorship works even when it is being mocked, because propaganda is about much more than the message. Haifeng Huang of the University of California, Merced, found in a study of Chinese university students that those with more exposure to ideological indoctrination, the sort she is pushing more of now in classrooms, are not necessarily indoctrinated, but they are, quote, more likely to believe that the regime is strong, and, quote, less willing to participate in political dissent. That is ultimately what she wants, what any smart authoritarian wants. No one even daring to think about challenging the party. That is why some tactics seen by critics as counterproductive or stupid are really not that at all. This is a values-neutral assessment. I mean, for the entire edifice does not hold together without a lot of repression. Enabled by China's economic rise and not unrelated by China's entry into WTO and to a lesser extent its successful bid for the Olympics in 2008. Not only did Chinese leaders no longer after this point need to come to a negotiating table prepared to make concessions on domestic matters, the rest of the world also needs China now so desperately that it is afraid even to comment seriously on human rights. This is the irony of China's deeper integration with the global economy. It has not made China more liberal. It has made the embassies of Europe into trade missions. We saw it dramatically with the UK this summer, but this has been going on for years. European leaders, once strident on human rights, bending a knee to Chinese markets. Even the United States, which is in a position that it can exercise the most leverage of anybody, exercises very little at this point. But for most everyone doing business with China, trumps virtually all other considerations. This is so helpful to the Chinese formula, for they can dial up repression at will. They can jail a university professor for life for some comments online. They can torture and disappear and all but break a lawyer they once called one of the top 10 lawyers in the country without 99% of the world noticing. They can jail the rest of the lawyers, virtually every hero of the Weichuan or rights protection movement that I mentioned from 2003. All of them either in jail or living in exile, except for maybe one or two. You can argue about what kind of reputational cost China takes for all this. Certainly the Nobel Peace Prize for Liu Xiaobo is part of that cost. I would argue that this is already priced into people's conceptions of China and mostly gets lost in the noise of other world events. How many people think today on the protests in advance of the 2008 Olympics after the Tibet riots, or on the thousands of school children who died in collapsed buildings in Sichuan, or indeed even think of Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel winner? China certainly does not pay a price for this economically or politically either. This is something that makes the, quote, China model, I think, unique in some respects and almost impossible to replicate. China has the market power and political muscle to achieve the scale and depth of repression and censorship it needs for the rest of the system to work. Now, how long can this state of affairs last? I would suspect China's strong position externally can last a very long time, even long after the economy falters, when and if it does. Internally, I think this is a trickier question. China's problems only get more complex. The subtler problems fester and carry long-term consequences, like all those miners with black lung disease. Mailing Bernie's, who I mentioned earlier, her surveys suggest that it will become more challenging over time for the system to continue to meet these challenges in ways that satisfies an increasingly demanding public. The targets just aren't flexible enough. They're not quickly responsive enough. They can work, though, for quite a while. I think we're talking about a very long time frame. How much time are we talking about? As my 16-year-old self learned all too well, the unpredictable is unpredictable. But China has done an excellent job of eliminating potential rivals to its power. The only credible rivals lie within the power structure itself at this point, the military, security apparatus. Expect that if the situation does get rough one day, things will turn uglier first. So I like to say that Gordon Chang, Mr. Coming Collapse of China, will be seen as a prophet one day in the year 2200. He called it only a half century in advance. In seriousness, I now still have some thoughts about the inevitability of democracy. China has a system of governments and set of conditions that could put off a day of reckoning for a long while. Interestingly, Fukuyama himself has hedged his bets on this. And just last week, he reportedly met in China with Xi Jinping. I imagine that was an interesting conversation. Maybe Xi was getting some ideas on governance. Who knows? Maybe on democracy. I sort of doubt it. I'm still a child of Fukuyama, but I've adjusted my expectations to a much longer time horizon. So apparently has he, and so should we all. So from there, I'd like to take your questions. Thanks.
I wonder what you think about the impact of what kind of world order there is outside of China. George W. Bush spoke about the balance of power in favor of freedom. And so if you had a large number of the external world powers being liberal democratic in some form, that arguably would provide some external constraint and also external opportunities for example, a rising generation to go elsewhere. But on the other hand, if you had a world order where there were other resilient authoritarian systems, like in Iran, that now that it's opening can do a similar reform and opening up operation, and one could imagine other places. So what difference does that external balance make? That if the rulers of China see that they have a model that's being embraced in various forms by other states that are doing a similar enterprise, would that strengthen both the appearance of inevitability and legitimacy versus something that's more like the balance of power in favor of freedom?
Right. That's a very good question. I think from a propaganda perspective, which is probably the most meaningful perspective to look at for what they're selling to their domestic audience about what's going on externally. What's most useful for them is when democratic revolutions falter, lead to chaos, when democracies get up to some of the same hijinks as China's accused of doing. Whether it's Snowden or Abu Ghraib or whatever examples you want to pick, they pretty effectively take advantage of these propaganda opportunities. And I do think that China's ability to export some of its techniques has served it well. But I'm not sure that really matters too much in them selling their system to their own people. But you do have many states, both in Central Asia, and Africa, Middle East, that are buying their technology for controlling the internet. I mean, they're literally buying their routers, and they can take off the shelf the ability to filter websites and et cetera. They don't have the real the personnel and the manpower and the knowledge the know-how to do very sophisticated kind of internet strategy that China has, and they also don't have their own homegrown market that's big enough for their own companies to thrive. So it's a little bit different in terms of exporting that. But I think that vision of, let's say, the internet and the fact that it is being replicated elsewhere also gives them an argument that the internet isn't how, let's say, American liberals would view it, and doesn't need to be that way. So I don't know if that completely addresses your question, but I would say that they're pretty happy with how the direction things are moving at this point. Yes?
I wanted to ask, you talked about the different pillars. Do you think the economic pillar is the most important for the Chinese regime to continue its stronghold?
I think it was, and yeah, I would say economic growth is the most helpful pillar when it's going, and it has been still strong enough to be the most important pillar. I do think that if it falters, then these other pillars become even more important. And I think without the pillars of nationalism and governance, and without making them as strong as you can, I think a faltering economy would put China in real peril. And what I'm trying to address is, I mean, it's already lasted this long. Maybe a fast-growing economy would have ensured that anyways. That plus repression, which is always a piece of resilient authoritarianism, is an effective repressive regime. But I think if you want to argue that this system could endure for much longer, you have to believe that these other pillars are being developed effectively as well.
So I was curious about, you talked about the hard targets and the soft targets for promotion of
Right.
cadres throughout the system. And you mentioned that basically at least until recently, social stability, the one-child policy, economic growth, those are basically the hard targets. And then there are the sort of softer ones that might be protecting the environment and rule of law. So at the Paulson Institute, we're doing a lot of work, as you know, on environmental issues, and we've been encouraged by the fact that in the past, year or so, the government has been talking a lot more about the importance of the environment, with their pollution crisis and whatever, and have also said that in the future, officials will be promoted based on one of the criteria will be, their environmental performance.
Right.
So I guess what I'm wondering is, when will we know if that has shifted to becoming a real hard target as opposed to still being they sort of say it's important, but it's still really a soft target?
Right.
Is it real or not?
Right. So it is already, in some areas, it's already real. And the way you know is, and they're not like publishing this for everybody, but there are ways to determine, some governments actually, you'll see, local governments, you'll see someone has posted online what the targets are. They're not, I don't think they're really supposed to be doing that, but some people, scholars have found targets that way, or mostly it's through interacting directly with officials and finding out what they are. Because this is actually, interestingly, not a system that the general Chinese public is extremely conscious of or aware of. And they don't go out. There is mention of these targets in the press. But it's not a focus that the people are kind of deeply aware of. So and they don't publish lists every year. Okay, these are the targets for everybody, and they're differentiated regionally, right? If air pollution is particularly bad in Beijing, then you're much more likely to see PM 2.5 control being a hard target in Beijing, and it would be a different set of targets in the west of China. So because of that, you can't just say it's a hard target everywhere. But anecdotally, I've been hearing that it has been moved up in some areas to that level. And to answer your question, there has to be a perception, I think, amongst peers that this affects your career. I mean, in the past, I think the perceptions have been, it's not just targets, it's also of course patronage and kind of it's not what you know, it's who you know. That's still how things work in any bureaucracy. But GDP growth certainly was perceived to be important for promotion, and controlling population growth and these other hard targets were perceived to be very important for promotion. And as soon as when environment gets to that point where people realize that it actually would be important for promotion, then I think you'll see a tipping point. And there has been, it helps that there's a lot of publicity about it within China, and it's pretty obvious that it's an embarrassment at least in the level of air pollution, the visible, where you can take photographs of it and they spread online. I don't know. It remains to be seen whether on the subtler problems, whether people will feel like they can get away with it. Now, this is something issue that the national government has always struggled with, is how to get better data, because they know cadres will try and juke the stats. And so that's not as much of an issue on air pollution, but it is an issue on a number of other environmental measures, right? Very difficult. And so I think it's going to be a long, slow kind of haul on those.
But you're suggesting, in a sense, that growing awareness actually is important in terms, like public awareness is important in terms of influencing policy as well, influencing.
Absolutely, I think it is. I mean, yeah. I think PM 2.5 is a good example of that. Yeah. That target in Beijing, for instance, wasn't changed until after the 5-year plan was already put into place. I think in 2012, they sort of improvised that they were going to elevate the importance of that target. And that was in response to public outcry. And I mean, this is one of the things I think is concerning about the even tighter controls on the internet, because if you do have less of that public discussion, then it's harder for those issues to bubble to the surface. But they also get a lot of inputs still, and I think they make somewhat effective use of them. Yes?
Hi. Oh, sorry. I have a two-part question. So I was talking to someone I worked with who's from China and keeps in touch with people around the time of the Hong Kong protests. And so the first part of the question was, I was sort of talking to him and sort of expected he would be sympathetic to the people in Hong Kong,
Right.
but he was not. And he was from the mainland, and he sort of conveyed the sentiment that many people that he knew on the mainland were not at all sympathetic to the people in Hong Kong, like almost of the opinion that like they already have so much, there's so much more flexibility there that he kind of felt like they were almost whining, which was I was just really surprised by. I just wouldn't have expected that. So I was wondering if you talk about that. And then the second part of the question was, we were having this continuing conversation, and I had asked him if he thought that those kind of protests would ever happen in China, like in the near future. And his response was no, because he didn't think that the middle class and upper middle class of China had enough respect for the lower classes in China that they wouldn't want to empower the like uneducated rural masses of China with the vote, because they would find that destabilizing. Which again I just had never even really thought about that. So I was wondering if you encountered that in your time there, that sentiment of towards Hong Kong and then also towards the rural masses in China.
Right. On Hong Kong, yeah, I've run into a lot of that. There's, I think, a feeling that, I would say that mainlanders tend to view, this is very broad brush generalization, right? But there is a class of mainlander that tends to view the people of Hong Kong as spoiled brats. They have this nice, much more free system. It's a relatively prosperous society, and what are they complaining about? I think it is. Of course, they're getting. I don't know what the level of information they're getting is a little bit different, and the perspective that they're getting it within is different. But yeah, I think there's a feeling of that Hong Kongers also feel superior. There's resentment of that, and then this goes both ways. There's a lot of resentment of mainlanders who are streaming into Hong Kong as well. I would say that I wouldn't say there's a lot of love across that border. So it doesn't surprise me that there's not a lot of sympathy either. The second question, that's much harder. I think it's you can't make a broad generalization about what upper middle class or middle class people will be discontented with or not. Yes, I would say there's lots of discrimination, feelings of antipathy towards migrants, towards lower class citizens. I think that's kind of true. That kind of classism is true in any society that's developed classes. But they also have their own complaints. They don't want a PX plant or some other polluting some plant they perceive to be a polluting chemical plant anywhere near them, and they'll protest those. And there have been protests in cities across China, kind of not in my backyard, protests. I do think you haven't seen the middle class rising up, because I do think in general they have gotten theirs. The people in cities are doing well. I think where you get to a problem in cities in China will be when you develop such urban slums or huge inequality that you would see some sort of kind of internal instability develop in big cities. We're not at that point. They have some real problems with their household registration system, where they're not doing a good enough job of integrating migrants into their cities. And I think it would be to their benefit. And I know the Paulson Institute feels the same way, and it's just written on this recently. Evan and Damien have. If they sped up hukou reform, hukou is the household registration system, and allowed migrants to have more rights along with alongside city residents. Now, there would be pushback against that, of somewhat of what you just described, this kind of resentment. People want to protect their access to education, to public services, et cetera, and they feel that would be threatened if hukou reform is sped up. And that's one of the big reasons. I think it's one of the big obstacles. There's other obstacles. And I think then you would see some of that resentment kind of maybe come to a boil in some places, but not in a way that challenges the viability of the regime, And so I think it's hard to make a generalization about that. Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time in China, and I've written a few books in China. One of My favorite is the Beijing Maestro, which is the story of Deng Xiaoping. But anytime I read the Financial Times and your publication, the Washington Post, Bloomberg, I always get in the narrative as if the West, and especially America, is jealous of China. Do you think that's a fact?
You feel that the narrative, you feel like that the stories are negative about China?
No, I said the narrative
Yeah.
is laced with jealousy regarding China. Like, how dare they become exceptional? Because we're the exceptional one. And I listen to you, and I'm getting the same thing from you all the time.
I can tell you I'm not jealous of China.
Is that right? Yeah, but why aren't you?
Why aren't I?
Yeah.
I think, you mean like, let's say, speaking from a regime perspective, or of the Chinese people, or, I mean, yeah.
Frontier, how they become, how they moving up, the China rise, the China dream, how dare they?
Yeah, I don't think there's no feeling from me and many reporters I know of how dare they. It's just like, this is surprising and interesting,
That's not the same thing.
I don't think it is. I think it's just a great story, and saying that in a values neutral way. It's an amazing story of our time, and I think that's how we approach that story. We're looking for the different implications of that rise.
The emphasis is in problems, but I could walk out Hyde Park and see problems.
Right. Well, this is what I was trying to say at the beginning. I think reporters focus on problems. That's what we do. we challenge politicians and governments around the world, whether democracies or otherwise, on what they do wrong. And what I was trying to talk about is that I also am very interested in looking at how a system works. And so that's actually really the point of my remarks today, actually. So I take your point. Thanks.
There are a lot of reporters and journalists and scholars out there today studying China, not necessarily because they're pursuing their own self-interest or because of jealousy or pursuing their own political agenda, but they're genuinely concerned about what is going on in China. And some of them commit the deadly sin of identifying human rights with Western values, which only causes reaction among the Chinese. But many others, they actually try to invite the Chinese to a global conversation for the greater good. And they do have an audience. A lot of Chinese people, especially young people these days, they study those ideas, those solutions, those proposals in the most detailed manner. But how much do you think those ideas are actually being wasted at the end of the day because of the level of ethnocentrism or fixed ideas or ingrained ideologies or basically peer pressure among the Chinese audience?
You mean Western liberal ideas?
Western liberal ideas.
Enlightenment ideas. Right.
Exactly, or any genuine solutions that are trying to invite the Chinese to a more global conversation. How much do you think those ideas being wasted because of the reasons I just listed?
Well, actually, I don't think they're being wasted because of ethnocentrism. The Enlightenment ideas were translated into Chinese at the end of the 19th and early 20th century and had a very wide audience at that time, at the end of the Qing, towards the end of the Qing. Those ideas inspired people like Sun Yat-sen. And a guy I wrote about for The Economist a couple of years ago named Song Jiaoren, who in 1911 and 12, in elections in China, his party, the kind of precursor to the Nationalists, it was called the Nationalists, but a precursor to the KMT basically, was swept into office in Parliament. He was going to be the prime minister. And unfortunately, the guy who was president at the time, Yuan Shikai, decided that was a threat, had him assassinated. And we never really got a real democratic experiment in China. But the people were all for it. And those ideals, and the press was lively at that time. There was a real opinion press in the early 20th century. Everybody with their own, every political party had their press, et cetera. I don't buy this ethnocentric argument. The people of Taiwan have a democracy. I think those values do translate. They absolutely translate. What you have is a political culture, a political culture defined by the Communist Party that makes it very difficult for those values to get a fair hearing in China. And it fits within this. There's this nationalist narrative. All of these are pushed by the government, and I would say they have a deep influence on the culture and the space for discussion in China, combined with censorship and also the fact that you might feel if you're talking about those things then you're being irrelevant. But I don't think this is about ethnocentrism at all.
So you've talked a fair amount about how the West has mixed interests in China stability or collapse. What about China's neighbors? So their close geographic neighbors, are they more likely to contribute to any decay, or is that actually an increase in, also including Russia?
Well, on a fundamental level, economically, they're all tied very strongly to China. Almost everybody in that region, virtually everybody, I'm not sure if there's an exception, their number one trade partner is China. I think if China's growth slows, that hits them even harder than China. So they have an interest, having a deep interest in China's system being stable as well. Not really, I would say even more so than the West. So.
Yeah, I'm Korean, and like you said, Korea's bonding to China is growing year by year. And I heard an interesting comment from Chinese friend that Korean president has a good reputation in China because she put a lot of priority to China compared to America, maybe. Yeah, and I thought that maybe as time goes by, the balance in East Asia might be changed. Maybe until now, the tie between Korea and China, Korea and America is much more stronger than the tie between Korea and China. But do you think that will it happen in a short period of time?
Well, not necessarily, and I think this is probably the second half of the answer I should give him as well. There's a security kind of perspective to look at here as well, and China has sort of aggressive territorial interests around its borders, and this concerns pretty much everyone that surrounds them, all these people who are their largest trade partners, including South Korea, although they do have they've developed a pretty strong relationship. I think that is, I would say, not ensured to go in one direction. That's very hard to measure. The security situation in Southeast Asia tends to favor actually those countries around China coming closer to the United States. I would say at least in the near term and midterm. Long term, it's very hard to say. It depends on kind of a lot on how China behaves in the coming years. And it depends in part on how the US behaves. But a lot of what has happened is, China has staked its claims in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and neighbors have responded to that. And many of them have moved closer to the United States because of that. So it's a bit more muddled. Obviously economically, people are much more closely tied together. There's other issues. South Korea and Japan aren't getting along, obviously. So it's pretty complicated. But it's hard to say that in the midterm, at least, that everything's just going to move into China's sphere of influence, and that's how the balance is going to shift. I'm not so convinced of that.
So on the topic of international relations, I read that you actually had a special subspecialty in North Korea when you were first covering China. Could you speak a little bit more about, recent developments in North Korean Chinese relationships? Because it seems as though that's changing substantially. And also, I don't know how much you're covering or following North Korea now, but can you speak to maybe some of the changes that in North Korea that might be affecting that relationship as well?
Right. I followed it enough on the relationship front. The recent news has been seems to indicate some sort of thaw in the relationship between China and North Korea, and then before that, there seemed to be a deep freeze. I think people maybe overinterpret, one envoy's trip to North Korea or one letter that people have reported has been written. The long-term situation is they're kind of stuck together. China has had a very long-standing position that North Korea is a buffer state. They don't want it to collapse. They would rather the status quo continue, although I think they would love to see a denuclearized Korean Peninsula. And they've gotten very angry with China over its nuclear tests. But there's a limit to what they've been willing to do with North Korea about that, and they've maintained mostly an economic relationship over time that has worked to North Korea's benefit over all this time. They've rarely threatened to pull the plug on that. I wrote a story back in 2003 after that during that round of the nuclear crisis, about how China was trying to convince North Korea to come to the table for talks. At that time, it was going to be three-party talks. North Korea and the U.S. Hosted in China, maybe, or the conception hadn't really been developed yet, and they cut off this oil pipeline to North Korea for a few days, and suddenly North Korea was willing to come to the table for talks. That was maybe what happened. Who knows? Maybe the pipeline just happened to not work for a few days. But that sort of dramatic step is not what China is known for doing in their relationship with North Korea. North Korea has its very complicated feelings towards China, even though China supplies much of its oil and its trade. They don't like to be talked down to. So it's a very complex relationship. Also, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about Kim Jong-un and his leadership. I think there's been some recoiling at his purges by some within the political establishment. But it's hard for us to make an interpretation about how that's going to affect the long-term future of their relationship. I think I wouldn't overinterpret the recent events.
Hey, thank you very much. So when you are thinking about the endurance, the possibility of whether or not the Chinese regime could endure, I mean, some people are talking about economic output, which draws some attention, especially this year. So, but some people also think, so how bad could the economy be really bad? I mean, it couldn't be worse, possibly worse than, starve 30 million people to death. And even that very sad, tragic episode didn't, wasn't followed by a collapse of the regime. So do you think that very sad, tragic episode has anything to do with the current scenario? And do you think if that has anything to tell us about right now what's going on in China? Thank you.
Well, I do think the Chinese people they can eat a lot of bitterness, as they say, but I don't know if that's especially true of them versus any other culture. I mean, what's important is has the system that is developed now, has it given other alternatives for organization? It hasn't. Has it developed these other pillars of legitimacy, other sort of an ideology to replace communism, nationalism, for them to kind of hold on to, let's say if the economy does falter. Have they maintained their repressive apparatus and responded to the challenges of technology? They have. So I think those are things that I would look at as sort of data points about whether an economic slowdown would lead to trouble. We are in a much more interconnected world now than then. I think the challenges are different. I do think this party has shown that it can adapt and evolve to respond to these challenges, but it is truly unpredictable when the day comes. If there's, massive labor unrest or there's strong disagreement in the elite leadership about how to proceed, you can imagine any sort of number of scenarios where things go haywire. But then what is the first, what would be the first thing to happen if, let's say, the regime suddenly felt itself unable or paralyzed to govern? Would maybe, as I mentioned, another power structure within the system, the military or the security apparatus, might assert itself? I mean, I would say the odds are against collapse in the near term, but you never you never know. As soon as I declare that, maybe the odds have just gone up.
Gady, thanks for coming to Chicago.
All right, thanks.